word reproduction, we talk about the biological reproduction of the species. And when we talk about the Tibetan so-called prayer wheel, to all Westerners the supreme symbol of superstition. Just let it go round and it says the prayers for you, and you don't have to do any work about it at all. And here it goes. But what's fascinating about it? Any child would like to do this. Let's keep it moving. In the same way, any child likes to do this. Swing it around. It's curious. It doesn't form a perfect circle because you have to make your hand go whoop, 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 whoop. And so its path is an ellipse. It's the same as the path of the Earth around the sun. It just swings. It goes around, around and around and around and around. An orange on the end of a string. What's the fascination of it? Why does one like to do this and just keep it up? You know, I'm sort of stuck with it right now, and I can hardly let go of it. No, I'm supposed to go on with this program, but I'm so fascinated with spinning this orange on the end of a string that I don't know if I'm going to make it. Why do we like to do that? We'll play music. We'll dance. When I was a boy in London, I used to love to visit the British Museum. And in the neighborhood of the museum, there are a number of old shops, some of them I think dating from the end of the 18th century. And on the inscription over the shop window, it said that they sold philosophical instruments. And I couldn't for the life of me make out what philosophical instruments could be, because I thought philosophers were people who simply sat thinking and wouldn't have any need for any special instruments. But when I went up to these shops, I found that what they had in the window were telescopes, slide rules, chronometers, and all sorts of what we would now call scientific instruments. Because, you see, the original name for science was natural philosophy. Because a philosopher is a person who is curious about everything. He's not only curious about theoretical matters, but he's also curious about what we should now call practical matters. And I regard myself as a philosopher in exactly that sense. Because aside from being interested in changed states of consciousness, in problems of death, problems of time and space, and the practice of meditation, I'm also interested in what you would call down-to-earth things, such as food, clothing, housing, problems of ecology and population, because all this is part of natural curiosity or philosophy. It's astonishing. All this is only 20 or 30 minutes from the heart of San Francisco. Not a human habitation in sight anywhere. I've been living out here for some months to write and to absorb an atmosphere that is different from the city, to try and find out what is the essential difference between the world of nature and the world of man. But I am part of all this. I am, as it were, one of the cells in this tremendous brain, which I can't understand, because the part cannot comprehend the whole. And yet at the same time, I don't feel, like so many people seem to feel, that I'm a foreigner or a stranger in this world. Its aesthetic forms somehow appeal to me more than most of the aesthetic forms which men have produced. I feel in it as if
In the same way, when you see a flower in a field, it's really the whole field that is flowering, because the flower couldn't exist in that particular place without the special surroundings of the field that it has. You only find flowers in surroundings which will support them. So in the same way, you only find human beings on a planet of this kind, with an atmosphere of this kind, with temperature of this kind, supplied by a convenient neighboring star. And so, just as the flower is a flowering of the field, I feel myself as a personing, a manning, a peopling of the whole universe. In other words, I seem, like everything else, to be a center, a sort of vortex at which the whole energy of the universe realizes itself, comes alive, a sort of aperture through which the whole universe is conscious of itself. I've just come back from Los Angeles. I was down there to meet with a group of rather important people, people in the movie industry, scientists and so on, who were considering calling a congress of the best minds in the world to meet in Los Angeles in the near future, to be a kind of planetary alarm conference. They wanted scientists and statesmen, religious leaders, and to do something to impress upon the world through all the media that we are in very serious danger of destroying the biosphere, that is to say, the whole envelope of living creatures which covers this planet, through pollution, overpopulation, nuclear fallout, poisoning of our food, and very lack of food. And we met to discuss the problem of organizing this conference, and here were all these brilliant people. And it came over us that we really didn't know what we ought to say. I mean, you can scream and create a state of panic, but that won't do any good. And when it came down to it, we didn't know what we ought to say because we really don't know what to do. Some things that we might do, for example, to increase the food supply with high-yield crops, may be ecological mistakes. And so the consensus of almost everybody at the meeting was that in some way or other, the human race has to learn how to leave the world alone and let what is called the natural homeostasis, that is the self-balancing process of nature, take care of the mess. Now, how are we going to do that? This is Japanese ceremonial tea. It's good on a cold day. See, our problem is we don't really know how to stop. We've got something started and we see it's going in a wrong direction. And I think the difficulty is, to borrow an old Chinese saying, that when the wrong man uses the right means work in the wrong way. In other words, there's something wrong with the way we think. And while that is there, everything we do will be a mess. Now, what is it that's wrong? Now, as far as I can see, the basic mistake is that we've invented this wonderful system of language and calculation, and that it is at once too simple to deal with the complexity of the world, and also we are liable to confuse that system of symbols with the world itself, just as we confuse, say, money with wealth. A lot of people are in business to make money instead of wealth. When they make the money, they don't know what to do with it. And so in the same way, we confuse happiness with status, and we confuse ourselves as living organisms which are one with this whole universe with something we call our personality. Now, what is our personality? Our personality is what we call our image of ourselves, and also our thought about ourselves, our idea of ourselves. This is the person. In other words, what people meet and understand, and what I understand as Alan Watts, is a big act which is not really me. Because in the image of Alan Watts, there are not all my unconscious processes, both psychological and physical. The construction of my brain is not contained in the concept Alan Watts, and the concept Alan Watts does not contain the inseparable relationships which I have with all the rest of the universe. And therefore that concept is a fraud. And when it's mistaken for the real me, there's a confusion, because if somebody says to me, Alan Watts, do something about it, the concept Alan Watts can't do anything. In other words, because it's only a concept, you can't make it lift a weight, just as 3 is a concept. 3, the number. You can't make just plain 3 do anything. So also you can't wrap up parcels with the equator. It's a useful imaginary line, but it can't do anything. But we all feel that this concept of ourselves, which we call our personality or our ego, can do something, because we think it really exists. And I'll tell you why we think it exists. What happens when you, if I were to say to you, now look hard at the television screen, really look at it. What do you do as distinct from just watching it in the ordinary way when you say, now I really got to see that? What do? Notice that you tighten muscles all around here, that you frown a little, you clench your teeth perhaps. Now what has that got to do with seeing anything clearly? It has absolutely nothing to do with it. Same thing when you listen carefully. Now listen, catch everything that's said, or you start tightening up around your ears. That has nothing to do with hearing clearly. Now from the moment we were little children, when teachers in class screamed at us, pay attention, we go tight in various ways, either to see or hear more clearly, to concentrate, or to will something which is supposed to be difficult to do. And that constitutes a habitual tension over the whole body that's there almost all the time. And that feeling of unnecessary tension is, as it were, the material sensation upon which we fasten this concept of I. We hang it on to that feeling. The concept is not us. The feeling of tension is completely phony. It has nothing to do with success in seeing, hearing, or acting. And so we get the marriage of an illusion with a falsehood, and that we call ourselves. And no wonder we feel cut off from everything, alienated, frightened of life and death. So what has to happen is we have to come back to a sane view of our own life, which is the way we really are, an organism functioning in terms of the whole environment, with the whole environment, instead of this funny little separate personality. But how are we going to do that? People say, oh, you can't change human nature overnight. You're asking us to give up the ego. And that's the most difficult of all things to do. Actually, it isn't, because the ego doesn't exist. But of course, if you try to give up your ego with your ego, then it'll take you to the end of time. Because this is the point. You can't transform yourself. You can't make yourself sane. You can't make yourself loving. You can't make yourself unselfish. And yet it's absolutely necessary that we be that way. It's absolutely necessary. If we are going to hand over the direction of nature to nature, which is what it comes to, it's absolutely necessary that we let go of ourselves, and it can't be done. Not by anything that we call doing it, acting, willing, or even just accepting things. You can't do it. Why? Because you don't really exist as that kind of a separate ego or personality. It's just an idea based on a phony feeling. So when it comes down to it, It's shocking news for us, for the human race, for our pride. You're only making a mess by trying to put things straight. You're trying to straighten out a wiggly world, and no wonder you're in trouble. So you can't do anything. So you can't transform yourself. And what can you do? What happens then if you actually realize you've come to a dead end? And the human race has come to a dead end, in my opinion. What then? Commit suicide? Or is there something else? What happens when you just wait? There's nothing you can do. You watch. And all you see is what goes on that is happening of itself. You're breathing, the wind is blowing, the trees are waving, your blood is circulating, your nerves are tingling. It's all going on of itself. But you know, that's you. That's the real you. The you that goes on of itself. It's not the symbol. It's not the person. It's you that's happening, as when you breathe. Yes, you can get the feeling that I am breathing by shoving your breath, but your breath goes on day in and day out without your doing anything about it or even thinking of it. The same way your brain is functioning without your forcing it. So when you come to a dead end, and we are individually and socially now in 1971 at a dead end, this is the moment of which it is said man's extremity is God's opportunity. Because we have to stop. And when we stop, we find a world that is happening rather than being done, being shoved. And that happening, as distinct from doing, is our fundamental self. And our fundamental self is not something just inside the skin. It's everything around us with which we connect. When you look out of your eyes at nature happening out there, you're looking at you. I'm not going to say what we should do from then on, but simply that before we think of doing anything in this critical situation, we realize the completely illusory nature of the beings that we think we are, and get back again to the beings that we really are, which includes all this outside world, no longer left outside.
It was as a result of looking at paintings like this that I first became interested in Eastern philosophy. That was many years ago, when I was a boy, only about 14 years old. And the thing that grasped me and excited me about this vision of the world was the astonishing sympathy and feeling for the world of nature. Think, for example, of a painting like this, which is called Mountain After Rain. A painting by the Chinese artist Gao Kogung, showing the mist and clouds drifting away after a wet night of pouring rain. And it's fascinating for us to think that pictures of this kind are not what we would call just landscape paintings. They are also icons. That is to say, they are a religious and philosophical kind of painting. Painting is perhaps a little closer to the real world than talking. If I wanted to show you, for example, how to do something rather complex like tying a knot,
It would be very difficult to explain in so many words how that knot is to be tied. But in an instant I can show you. And in this way, a picture shows us far more than words ever can. And so it's closer to nature. Now, what happens when the same thing is done in writing? The formal character of writing gives way to a purely spontaneous way of writing in what is called grass style. Here's a poem which says, "The morning dawns, but the dusky night follows soon. So is life like a crystal drop of dew. Unconcerned, the morning glory goes on, blooming, blooming, its short yet full life." The animal probably doesn't concern itself very much with problems of future disease, death, or starvation, and things of that kind. If an animal sees another dead animal lying around, I don't suppose he thinks to himself, well, one day that's going to happen to me. Rather, he just sees a dead animal, sniffs it, sees whether it's good to eat, and wanders away. But for human beings, it's entirely different, because we actually spend most of our time and a great deal of our emotional energy living in time which is not here, living in an elsewhere which is not concretely real. So much so that although we may be quite comfortable and happy in our present circumstances, if there is not a guarantee, not a promise of a good time coming tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, we are at once unhappy, even in the midst of pleasure and affluence. And so we develop a kind of chronic anxiety about time. We want to be sure more and more, because of our sensitivity to the feeling of time, we want to be sure more and more that our future is assured. And for this reason, the future becomes of more importance to most human beings than the present. And in this sense, we are hooked, taken in by a Maya, because it is of very little use to us to be able to control and plan the future unless we are capable at the same time of living totally in the present.
The organization of human life, its systems of communication and systems of control are extended more and more and more in just the same way, for example, that by assimilating the minerals out of the soil and the rays out of the sunlight, a plant like a fern grows and grows and grows and extends its form. And in this way, its organization prevails. Now then, you see, if you take this task of what we call the conquest of nature, the task of making order victorious over chaos or randomness, if you take this seriously, you will look upon it as warfare. And you will firmly believe that the most urgent thing that there possibly can be is to make order prevail over randomness, to make good prevail over evil, to make life prevail over death. And we find that when we are in a contest of this kind, a serious warfare game of this kind, and we take it seriously, we are involved in it in a very deep and bitter sense. Now, the difference of Buddhism from science as a form of knowledge is that in Buddhism it would be said that this view of things, this view of the task of life as making order triumph over disorder, leaves something out. You remember right at the beginning I made some importance of a Sanskrit word which is fundamental in Buddhism, avidya. Avidya, which meant means non, vidya, knowing. non-knowing or ignorance, or better, ignorance. Ignorance, in other words, leaving something out of account. And I want to use a familiar illustration to show in what way we ignore. You see here a figure which is apparently, as you look at it, two faces in profile about to kiss each other. Now, if we draw back a little from those two faces, we can see on the white area in between them the form of a cup. But the interesting thing about this is that as you look at it, you will either be able to see the form of the cup or the form of the two faces in profile, as it were, about to kiss each other. You can alternate them between them very rapidly, but you will not be able to see them both that way at the same time. In other words, either the white must be the background and the black the figure on the ground, or else the black must be the background and the white cup showing up on it. And so in this way, we are unable to see, really, we can think it. After a while, we can get accustomed to the idea that the figure and the ground, the black and the white, are mutually necessary to each other. In that figure that I showed you, you could say both the cup with the stem and the two faces are there. But our ideas about them, our concepts, are mutually exclusive, and we cannot see them both at the same time. And in the same way, in this figure that I drew, we either see the sawn-off stumps or the bear claws. It's difficult to see this figure both ways at the same time. And so, also, just as we see one and not the other, so we identify ourselves. After all, when you're looking at the white figure in that illustration, which is the cup, you, as it were, identify with the cup. When you look at the two faces, you identify with the profile. So in the same way, when we experience the world around us, we identify with the subject, the knower. We don't identify with what we see. But as a matter of fact, if there is nothing seen, there is no experience of a seer. If there is no seer, there is no experience of anything seen. They both go together in the same way as the black and the white. And this idea that the yes and the no, the black and the white, the inside of a class, say we draw a square as representing fundamentally the idea of class. I can't have a square which doesn't have both inside and outside. They go together. And in Buddhism, this going together is called shunya. Although this is often translated void, it means that the inside of the square cannot exist, is void without the outside, the subject without the object, the black without the white. And this, of course, is represented in this fundamental Chinese figure of the yang, or the positive principle, and the yin, or the negative principle, like two fishes, constantly circulating, going round and round and round and round in the alternations of life. Now, the question is, are these two fishes involved in a fight? Is the white one eating up the black one, and the black one trying to eat up the white one? If that is the situation, then, of course, life is fundamentally nothing but a grim contest. If this one up here is the good fellow, and this one is the bad fellow, if this is order and this is chaos, then a fight goes on between them. And that's largely the way in which our technology has interpreted man's situation as against nature. This is man, the white, the good fellow. This is nature, the dark, the bad fellow. And the white one has got to eat him up. But what happens if the white fish succeeds in eating up the dark fish? The white fish disappears as well as the dark one, because the white one is only there in relation to the dark. So then, If these two fishes, as it were, wake up, if this one wakes up and this one wakes up, which is called awakening in Buddhism, they realize they're one. In other words, they go together. They're inseparable from each other. And this realization is that experience, which is called in Zen Satori, or in Buddhism Bodhi, awakening. This sudden dawning on our consciousness that life is not really a contest to make yes triumph over no, to make the positive triumph over the negative. The two sides go together. And then one sees in this strange way that underlying all that is negative in the world, all that is in a way painful and evil, there is a kind of necessity to it. It goes with the good. It is necessary for the good. Disorder is necessary for the manifestation of order, just as you must have, say, a black background to show up a light figure. And then when one sees that, a profound transformation takes place in one's attitude to the world. That is to say, instead of looking upon life as a contest, it becomes a dance, it becomes a game. One doesn't withdraw from it, one doesn't stop living, but one goes into the game so that these revolving fishes are no longer trying to eat each other, but they're just going around dancing, having the biggest fun in the world. So then, must we have fixed in our minds the idea that all the forms and patterns of nature are simply methods of attack or defense, that they're devices for camouflage, that they're simply lures for sexual attraction or other utilitarian purposes? Or can we see in them a dance, a joyous cosmology?
We have a saying in Latin, ex nihilo nihil fit, which means that out of nothing comes nothing. You can't, in other words, get something out of nothing. And it's occurred to me that this is a fallacy of tremendous proportions that lies at the root of all our common sense, not only in the West, but in many parts of the East as well. Because what has struck me is that nothing, the negative, the empty, is exceedingly powerful. I would say, not ex nihilo nihil fit, out of nothing comes nothing, but I would say you can't have something without nothing.
We all know that energy is always vibration, pulsation. Whether it be the energy of light or the energy of sound, it's always on and off. So that all wave motion, then, is this process. And it's curious, isn't it, when we think of waves and talk about waves, we think about the crests. We think about this point. And we say, that is waves. And that is because the crests stand out from the underlying uniform bed of water, which is relatively solid in comparison with the space above, so that these crests are perceived as the things, the forms, the waves. But to have sound, you must have the alternation of sound, silence, sound, silence, sound, silence. And so you get that which you can hear on a very deep note. Now the same thing is true of all life together. We shouldn't really contrast existence with non-existence, because actually existence is the alternation of to be and not to be, of positive and negative, of on and off.
So you could say existence is eternal if we are to consider existence as this alternation of now you see it, now you don't, now you see it, now you don't, now you see it, now you don't. It is that contrast that presents the sensation of there being anything at all. Now, in light and sound, these waves are extraordinarily rapid so that we don't hear the interval between them. But there are other circumstances in which the waves are extraordinarily slow, as in the alternation of day and night, light and darkness, and the much vaster alternations of life and death, of the great slow cycles of the world. But these alternations are just as necessary to the being of the universe as in the very fast motions where we get it in light and in sound and in the sense of solid contact, where it's going so rapidly that we notice the continuity, or the is side, and we ignore the intervention of the isn't side. But it's there just the same, just as there are vast spaces within the very heart of the atom. You know, too, how smells are so powerful in evoking memories. Something you smelled as a child. Say, the smell of fresh coffee being cooked early in the morning, or bacon frying, or leaves being burned on an autumn day. All these things evoke very vivid emotions and feelings of our childhood in the past. But you know, when people talk about very deep things, they never talk about the sense of smell. They talk about touch, vision, and even taste and hearing. For example, we hear about the vision of God. In the Catholic Church, it is said that the highest thing to which man can attain, or to which the angels can attain, is the beatific vision, to see God. And the prophets would hear the word of the Lord. And in one of the Psalms it says, "Oh, taste and see how excellent the Lord is." Taste and see. But no one ever had the idea of smelling God, of having not just the beatific vision, but the beatific smell. This has never been brought out. And yet, curiously enough, throughout the whole history of religions, until we got to what is called the phenomenon of the Protestant nose, we've had incense. Hindus use incense, Buddhists use incense, Mohammedans use incense, Catholics use incense. But there came a break at the time of the Reformation when incense was somehow given up. Oh, Hebrews use incense too, or used to. And why is this? Why this repression of the sense of smell? I don't fully know the answer to that question, except to say that I do know that it is repressed. And that it's a shame we're depriving ourselves of a whole world of wonder, because the nose is just as sensitive as the ears, and there can be music for the nose in the same way as music for the ears, and the same way as there can be glories for the eyes, there can be glories for the nose. And I don't know why we're so diffident, so uptight about admitting that we have noses. Because, of course, we very well recognize that animals have the most incredible senses of smell and can detect all sorts of things, open up to themselves a whole new world of experience by simply using their noses. Now, if you don't use your nose, you are really in just as pitiable a condition as somebody who was born blind or deaf. You've lost a whole sense.